Welcome back to the deadly web of serial killer James Hicks. In part 2, we delve even deeper into the chilling story of James Hicks and his horrifying crimes. This chapter brings us face to face with the tragic tale of Lynn Willette, a strong, independent woman who fell victim to Hicks' sinister nature. As his pattern of violence and manipulation unfolds, the web of terror grows darker, leaving an indelible mark on the quiet towns he haunted. Stay with us as we uncover the shocking twists and the relentless pursuit of justice that finally brought Hicks to face his fate. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping true crime stories and exclusive updates. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next chilling tale. Lynn Willette was described by her sister Wendy as a jack of all trades. And fiercely independent. Lynn was somebody you could rely on to fix a kitchen sink and maintain a gorgeous garden. She was a talented artist who was accepted into Disney's cartoon school in Florida, but turned it down to get married after graduating high school. The marriage, however, was short-lived. From there, she joined the Army and became a machine operator of heavy equipment in Oklahoma. She received an honorable discharge from the Army, and eventually returned home to Maine after working as a paramedic in California, and living in North Carolina with an ex-husband. Lynn had been married and divorced twice. Wendy said, Lynn was always getting involved with men who wanted to protect her. She hated that. Her marriages always ended on good terms. But she was always the one who left. She had a strong need to be her own person. After returning to Maine in 1994 in her late 30s, Lynn was hired by a man named James "Jimmy" Hicks to be a maintenance worker at the Twin City Motor Lodge in Brewer, Maine. She and Jimmy, who was now 43, started talking, and went out on just a few dates before he told her that he was being kicked out of his trailer, and needed a place to live. The relationship progressed rather fast and he ended up moving in with her at her apartment in Brewer. But the relationship wasn't working for Lynn. She felt smothered by the relationship, and unbeknownst to Jimmy, she was preparing to leave him. On May 18, 1996, Lynn finally told him she was done. She'd been quietly moving some of her things over to her mother's house, and told Jimmy he could stay at the apartment. Over the next week, he showed up at the house on an almost daily basis after work, and would call incessantly, sometimes even at 4:30 in the morning. 1 week later, Lynn didn't come home from work. The next day, Sunday morning, she missed a family Memorial Day weekend barbecue that she had organized. By 1 p.m., when Lynn still wasn't at the cookout, Wendy decided to inform the police. But it was James Hicks who made the first call to State Detective Joseph Zamboni. The search for Lynn went day and night. Wendy said that she would sometimes even go out at midnight upon her mother's insistence to search for her sister. But nothing ever turned up. A year later, Lynn still hadn't returned. But since her disappearance, the Geraldine Towers case took priority again. In 1992, the family had Geraldine legally declared dead after a decade of no answers. Her sister told the Bangor Daily News it was Geraldine that led police to arrest Hicks for Jenny's death, and I've always thought that maybe someday Jenny will somehow lead police to solve Geraldine's murder. Chief Jim Ricker was also confident Geraldine's case would be solved, and believed the answer was Occam's razor, saying, "Why is it that of all the people in Maine, only the girlfriends of James Hicks seem to disappear? You can't investigate one of these cases without investigating all three," said Detective Joe Zamboni. He also said investigators recently had taken another look at Jenny's case to compare notes. The only outlier in the situation was Geraldine, who only knew Hicks for one night. Not long after Lynn disappeared, James Hicks found love again in 18-year-old Brandy Mayo, and she was pregnant. Her 43-year-old future husband, James Hicks, was 25 years her senior. Their baby was subsequently taken by the Department of Human Services. They eventually relinquished all of their parental rights. Later that year, Brandy was pregnant, again, and to avoid having the state taking away their second child, they moved to Levelland, Texas, a small town of about 13,000, close to where Brandy's grandparents lived, thinking this would remedy the situation. After learning of James' dark history from investigators in Maine, and allegations of sexual abuse from his now adult children, officials in Texas took their new baby boy on temporary custody. Despite the allegations against her now husband, Brandy refused to believe that he was a killer. "All I've ever wanted was for someone to give me proof," she said during a scheduled custody hearing at the district court in Levelland. 2 years later, Brandy was pregnant for a third time, and she and James were living a relatively quiet life. But the underlying rage of a dangerous man can't stay quiet for long, and a nightmare was about to be unleashed on a sleepy Texas town. In April of 2000, Jimmy was working independently doing handiwork. He'd been working for 67-year-old June Moss at her single-story brick home in West Texas for about 6 months. He arrived at 9 a.m. on Saturday, April 8th to do some painting and floor work. Later that day, after returning to buy some tiles and paint, he unloaded the van and picked up a beer can, asking, "Do you care if I drink?" June told him that yes, she did care. She didn't want him to drink in her home. James reluctantly set the beer back in the van. As June sat in the den, she saw Jimmy come around the hallway and enter the room. There was something off about him. He was swearing, something June didn't like, and walked up so close to her until his knees touched hers. Then she noticed the gun that was hanging from one of his hands. He said, "I can't do your house. It's taking too long. It's just taking too long." June was frozen with fear, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear what he was saying. She tried to stand up, but he pushed her back down, looming over her. She then reached for the phone on the table that was right by the chair, but he grabbed it from her and disconnected it. James then went into the kitchen, locking the deadbolt, and continued to do the same on the other doors in the house. He said, "I need 2 things from you. I need your time and your money." He said he had to get out of the state and that it would take him 4 hours. He paced back and forth, growing with anger. "I've been married 4 times, I killed my wife, and I can't see my son because of Child Protective Services." She begged him to leave her home. Then, he stopped. June later recounted that she was shaking, but trying not to let him see her fear. He calmly walked over to her and told her to get up. She told the Bangor Daily News, "I said no, and he shouted at me and said get up and go to the bedroom, and he pulled my arm and began dragging me to the bedroom. He was pulling on my arm so hard I had a bruise. Then he got behind me, put his left hand on my shoulder and pushed me forward. That's when he shot the gun. The bullet went right by my right ear and I jumped because I didn't expect it. I turned around and saw him pointing the gun at the ceiling. 'Go to the bedroom,' he said, loudly. So, I started down the hall towards the bedroom. He then left the room and came back with a blue department store bag and some beer. As he was drinking the beer, pacing around the room, he demanded the keys to her house, and the title and keys to her car. He then slammed a notepad in front of her. 'Write this to your children,' he said. June was sobbing. He made her write what she thought was a suicide note. He reached into the blue bag and pulled out a 20 ounces Diet Coke bottle filled to the brim of a black concoction that definitely wasn't Coke. 'Here, I want you to drink this. It's cherry cough medicine.' He took a swig and handed it to her. He forced her to drink about half the bottle, as much as she could handle until she started vomiting. The liquid that came back up in the trash can was red. She begged him not to make her drink anymore and he yelled at her to hurry up and finish it, all the while waving a gun in her face. He then left the room and started filling up a bathtub. He kept returning to the den where June sat, shaking and trying to stomach his cherry cough syrup cocktail. James then went down the hallway, and June heard a familiar sound. The tinkling of wind chimes. He was getting into a closet she'd mentioned to look for guns. "I have a small set of chimes on the closet door. I heard that sound and I knew where he was and that he was looking for those guns. I jumped up, and I had been sitting for so long I was kind of stiff, but I ran to the door and slid the chain off and turned the doorknob, and neither one made a sound, and then I did the deadbolt because I knew that would be louder. I turned that deadbolt, and I ran. I ran over to my neighbor's door and ran inside, and I was running all over that house trying to find someone. I found their grandson laying on a bed talking on the phone and I told him to lock all the doors. Those wind chimes saved June's life." June spent that night in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness from the amount of cough syrup she consumed, but she survived. And James Hicks was once again arrested. Only this time, it wasn't looking good. Jimmy was facing charges of aggravated assault and robbery, and if convicted, because of his status as a felon, he faced 15 to 99 years in prison with no chance of parole. Normally, aggravated robbery brings a lesser charge, but this was also a crime that caused injury to an elderly woman, and Texas takes violent crimes against the elderly seriously. Officials have a feeling James Hicks will see a good portion of the rest of his life behind bars. Texas might not have been the best choice. He might have wanted to have chosen another state to live in if he was going to commit a crime, said Lubbock County Sheriff David Gutierrez. After spending only a couple of weeks behind bars, Jimmy discovered he didn't enjoy life inside the Texas jail system. He began working on a plan to get back to Maine, according to a court affidavit. He wanted to strike a deal with Maine authorities. Former Newport Police Chief Jim Ricker told Murder, She Told, he immediately gets on the phone with Detective Zamboni and wants to confess to all his crimes in Maine. But the deal is, he wants them to drop the charges in Texas and he'll come back here and admit to murder if we'll take him back to serve a life sentence in Maine. Zamboni reminded him that there were no outstanding warrants for his arrest in Maine, and he couldn't just bring him back so that he could confess here. He pried Hicks, saying that he didn't know what Hicks was going to tell him, if and when he was ever brought back to Maine. He needed something good. "You know exactly what I'm going to tell you," James responded. He agreed to tell them where the bodies were if he got to come back to Maine to serve his time. But 2 out of the 3 families of the victims said they would sacrifice knowing where their loved one was if it meant James Hicks would stay put in Texas, knowing how much he hated it there. Denise Clark, Jenny's sister, said Jimmy Hicks has controlled the situation the whole time. He has always had his way. Now, he's still trying to control it by getting to come up here because he doesn't like it in Texas. Let him stay there. He hates it there, from what I understand, so I think that's a good place for him to spend the rest of his life. Jimmy pled guilty to aggravated robbery, and as part of a bargain, agreed to cooperate with Maine state detectives in a deal that would allow him to return to Maine to reveal where his secrets were buried. On October 4, 2000, during an interview with detectives, James Hicks finally confessed to killing Lynn Willette in May of 1996. He said he'd suffocated her at the apartment in Brewer they used to share. He agreed that once he returned to Maine, he would show detectives where the remains of Lynn Willette, Geraldine Towers, and Jenny Hicks were located. Upon his return to Maine, on October 10, James Rodney Hicks was formally charged with the murder of Lynn Willette. This was the only confession so far, and he couldn't be charged again with Jenny's murder. That same day, Jimmy led investigators to 2 separate sites to begin the search for remains, one in Etna where his family's farmhouse used to stand, and the other up in Forkstown Township in Aroostook County. Forkstown is very remote and sparsely populated. It's part of an unorganized territory with other surrounding townships. Forkstown is also part of the Haynesville Woods, notoriously known to be one of Maine's most haunted stretches. The Haynesville Woods is mostly only seen by long-haul truckers, and was made popular in 1965 by Maine country singer Dick Curless with his song, "A Tombstone Every Mile," referencing the frequent accidents that happened and the lives that were taken along Route 2A. The Haynesville Woods is probably the perfect place to hide a body in Maine. The family of Lynn Willette accompanied investigators to the Forkstown dig, though they didn't find anything on the first day and planned to reconvene the following. The site they were working at is a turnaround that's used for snow plows and to dispose of unwanted dirt that was dug up from ditch creation. The first body was discovered beneath an apple tree along the tree line of the property. The following day, they found a second body just behind a small shed to the right of the abandoned tar shack. By late afternoon, both sets of remains had been removed and taken to the medical examiner's office in Augusta. It was clear that Geraldine had been dismembered and mostly buried in one place. Jenny was also dismembered under the apple tree, with only 6 inches of soil above her. He indicated that in some spots he buried parts and others he disposed of them on top of the ground, giving the team a slim likelihood that a complete skeleton will ever be found. Back in Forkstown, investigators were still searching for the remains of Lynn Willette with no success. Because the soil was much softer, they speculated the remains might be deeper and more difficult to find. The team used heavy machinery to dig buckets of dirt from the ground, but Lynn's sister Allison said, "I wish they'd bring Jimmy Hicks out here with a spoon and make him do this." Finally, after 2 days of digging along roadsides in Forkstown Township with no success, the remains of Jimmy's third known victim were discovered. Lynn had finally been found. She had been dismembered and put into cement-filled buckets that Jimmy claimed to have used as a grave marker. James said he killed Lynn Willette when she returned to the apartment they used to share to get some of her things. As she was leaving, he strangled her from behind with a cord. He said that he kept Lynn's body in a homemade wooden box for several days in the maintenance room at the Twin City Motor Inn before dismembering and disposing of her remains in Holden, Ellsworth, and Forktown Township. He told them that he drove her car to Dysarts and Herman the same day that he killed her, abandoning it in the employee parking lot before riding his bike back to Brewer. More details were also revealed about what exactly was found buried in the ground in Forkstown. It was Lynn's head, embedded in a cement block inside one of the buckets, and her hands and feet in another. He said he met Geraldine Towers at the Gateway Lounge in 1982 that fateful October night, and they enjoyed each other's company over drinks and had a good time. He said that after he left the bar, he saw Geraldine at a gas station and offered to give her a ride home. An argument ensued in the car, and he snapped. James said he strangled her from the back seat with his hands. He then dismembered her body, wrapped it in a plastic sheet, and buried her in the dirt floor of a shed that used to be a chicken coop. Geraldine's rings were found still on her skeleton fingers. On the night of July 18, 1977, James and Jenny Hicks got into an argument after she told him she was leaving. He decided that she wasn't, so he removed his belt and strangled her with it until she was dead. Like the other women, he then dismembered her, scattering her remains throughout Carmel and Etna. Except for one part. Jenny's head. He placed it in a plastic bag inside a cooler and filled it with cement, leaving it around the trailer. Former members of the trailer park remember seeing Jimmy carting the cooler around as if surreptitiously putting it on display. But perhaps the most horrifying part? James Hicks used it as a chair at the table, and made Jenny's children sit on their own mother's head inside a cement-filled cooler while they ate breakfast. Eventually he removed the cement block and buried it near the apple tree in the backyard of his mother's old house. That's what investigators discovered that day. The rest of her remains were never found. James Hicks never gave a reason for the killings but said it seemed that something just comes over him. Zamboni told the Lubbock Avalanche Journal before his confessions, "I looked at him one day and said, you know, you have to go to jail or another woman is going to die." He said, "Yeah, I think you're right." On November 17, 2000, surrounded by 10 officers in the Bangor courtroom arraignment, Hicks pleaded guilty to murdering, dismembering, and scattering the remains of 2 women. At sentencing 2 weeks later, he was given a life sentence, which in Maine, has no option for parole. He gave no apology and didn't show any signs of remorse. In fact, he didn't even look up. Geraldine's daughter, Tammy, spoke in court during a victim impact statement, saying, "I spent my life trying to remember what my mother sounded like, smelled like and felt like. But my mother didn't abandon me. You killed my mother, cut her up, and discarded her like garbage. I won't let you destroy my life, James Hicks. Today my roller coaster ride stops and I get off, leaving you behind." The story of James Hicks is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface. From his manipulation of relationships to the brutal murders and the cold dismemberment of his victims, Hicks' crimes left scars on families and communities that will never fully heal. His eventual arrest and confession brought some closure, but the horrors he inflicted remain etched in the memories of those who lived through it. While justice was served with his life sentence, the tragedy of his victims, like Lynn Willette, Geraldine Towers, and Jenny Hicks, continues to echo. Their lives were cut short by a man driven by violence and control, but their stories live on as a testament to their strength and as a warning of the dangers that can hide behind a friendly face. Thank you for following this harrowing journey. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to the channel for more true crime stories that uncover the darkest corners of human nature. Turn on notifications to stay updated on new episodes.